Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
Every school child in America learns the same tidy version of Abraham Lincoln's origins. Born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, raised in poverty, self-taught by candlelight, the rail splitter who became the 16th president and saved the Union. It's a clean story, the kind that fits neatly on a plaque. But there's a piece of that story Lincoln himself tried to bury, a piece so sensitive that he swore his closest friend to secrecy about it, and a piece that a team of geneticists finally cracked open a century and a half after his death. What they found didn't just settle an old genealogical argument. It exposed how cruelly the American legal system once treated women and children, and it revealed a genetic signature so unexpected that it forced historians to rethink what colonial American ancestry even meant. This is the story of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the mother Abraham Lincoln credited with everything he became, and the secret written into her blood. Sometime around 1850, Lincoln was riding through Menard County, Illinois, with his law partner, William Herndon. The two men spent countless hours together on the legal circuit, and over the years, Herndon became one of the very few people Lincoln trusted with anything personal. Lincoln almost never talked about his mother's family. He avoided the subject so consistently that people who knew him for decades noticed the silence. But on this particular ride, something made him open up. According to Herndon's own later account, Lincoln told him that his mother was illegitimate, the daughter of an unnamed Virginia man he described as well-bred. He asked Herndon to keep it quiet while he was alive. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added the line that would later become one of the most quoted sentences in American biography. He owed everything he was, or ever hoped to be, to her. Herndon honored that request for the rest of Lincoln's life. It wasn't until 1889, 24 years after the assassination, that he finally published it in his biography, Herndon's Lincoln. The reaction was immediate and furious. Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's only surviving son, was reportedly livid. Lincoln loyalists accused Herndon of slander, of drunkenness, of trying to cash in on a dead man's reputation. For the next 100-plus years, this single claim split Lincoln scholarship into two camps that genuinely despised each other. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what illegitimacy actually meant in that era. In 18th and 19th century America, a child born outside of marriage occupied a strange legal void. English common law, which most of the colonies and early states inherited, used the Latin phrase filius nullius, literally, child of no one. An illegitimate child had no legal father in the eyes of the law, no inheritance rights, no claim to a father's name, property, or protection. The child was, legally speaking, attached to nobody but the mother, and even that connection was often treated as a source of shame rather than identity. The consequences fell hardest on the mother. In many colonies and early states, giving birth outside of wedlock wasn't just socially scandalous, it was a criminal offense. Unmarried pregnant women could be hauled before a court, formally charged, fined, and in some jurisdictions sentenced to public whipping or a stint in a house of correction. The underlying theory was that an illegitimate birth created a potential burden on the parish or county, since there was no legal father obligated to support the child. So the state treated the pregnancy itself as a public nuisance worth punishing. Frontier Virginia and Kentucky, where the Hanks family lived, were exactly the kind of communities where these laws were enforced through local grand juries and county courts. And that's precisely where the paper trail on Lincoln's grandmother begins. Buried in the archives of Mercer County, Kentucky, researchers eventually found a grand jury indictment dated November 24, 1789. It charged a woman named Lucy Hanks with fornication. In the legal language of the time and place, a fornication charge against an unmarried woman almost always meant one thing: she had given birth or was visibly pregnant without a husband. The timing lines up with disturbing precision. Nancy Hanks, the woman who would become Lincoln's mother, was born around 1784. Her sister Sarah was born around 1787. Both births predate any known marriage for Lucy Hanks. Then, just 5 months after that 1789 indictment, Lucy herself signed a handwritten note giving her consent to marry a man named Henry Sparrow. The original document survives, spelling errors and all, and in it she certifies that she is of age and freely gives her approval for the marriage to proceed. Lucy and Henry married on April 30th, 1790. Shortly afterward, the fornication charge against her was dropped. Marriage, in the eyes of the court, had restored her respectability. But that legal rehabilitation didn't extend backward to cover the daughters she'd already had. Nancy carried the Hanks surname for her entire life, not because it was a stylistic choice, but because under common law, an illegitimate child took the mother's name. There was no father's name to give her. Whoever he was, he never appeared in a single surviving record. For well over 100 years after Herndon's book came out, professional historians fought bitterly over whether his account was even true. Some, like the early 20th century Lincoln scholar William Barton, dug into the same records and concluded Herndon had been right all along. Nancy was illegitimate, and Lucy Hanks was her unmarried mother. Others rejected the theory outright. A rival camp of researchers, including the well-respected Lincoln historian Lewis Warren, argued that the whole story was a myth invented to smear Lincoln's memory. Warren proposed an alternative, that Lucy Hanks had actually been born Lucy Shipley, one of 5 Shipley sisters, and that she had briefly been married to a man named James Hanks before he died, which would make her connection to the Hanks family through marriage rather than birth, and would make Nancy perfectly legitimate. Warren was so confident in this alternate genealogy that in the 1940s he dismissed the illegitimacy story outright as one of Herndon's fabrications. Both camps had circumstantial evidence. Neither had proof. Frontier record-keeping in late 1700s Virginia and Kentucky was thin to begin with. No reliable birth certificates, spotty church registries, families that moved constantly and rarely left a clean documentary trail. The argument dragged on for generations, consuming the careers of amateur and professional genealogists alike, without anyone landing a decisive blow. It took modern genetics to finally end it. In 2015, a team of genetic genealogists, including researchers such as Suzanne Hallstrom and several colleagues who had spent decades on Hanks family research, set out to resolve the question using mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Mitochondrial DNA is uniquely useful for this kind of problem because it passes almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along a strictly maternal line. A father contributes essentially none of it. That means a woman alive today can carry nearly the same mtDNA sequence as a female ancestor who lived centuries earlier, as long as the line runs mother to daughter without a break. There was an obvious complication. Abraham Lincoln has no living, direct descendants. His last confirmed descendant, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, died in 1985 without children, which means the Lincoln bloodline itself is extinct. But mtDNA doesn't require testing Lincoln's own descendants. It only requires finding living people who descend through an unbroken chain of mothers from women in his maternal line. In this case, the sisters, daughters, and granddaughters of Lucy Hanks and her mother, and Lee Hanks. The researchers built 2 comparison groups. Group A consisted of living women who could trace an unbroken maternal line back to, and Lee Hanks, the grandmother Herndon's account implicated as Nancy's true grandmother. This group included descendants through multiple daughters, including children Lucy Hanks had later, after her marriage to Henry Sparrow, which meant the sample wasn't relying on a single fragile family branch. Group B consisted of living descendants of the Shipley sisters, Naomi and Rachel Shipley. The women Warren's alternate theory depended on. If Warren was right, both groups should have shared the same mtDNA, since his theory claimed Lucy Hanks and the Shipley sisters were part of the same maternal line. If Herndon was right, the 2 groups should show no genetic relationship at all, because they'd represent 2 completely separate families with 2 completely separate maternal ancestors. The lab work, conducted through Family Tree DNA's genetic testing service, produced results announced on October 21, 2015, deliberately timed to the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. The findings were unambiguous. Every descendant in Group A, tracing back through different daughters and different generations to and Lee Hanks, carried an identical, extremely rare mitochondrial haplogroup. X1c. Group B, the Shipley descendants, carried a completely different and far more common haplogroup, H, found in roughly half of all Europeans. The two groups did not share a maternal ancestor. Not recently, and not in any historically relevant time frame. The Shipley theory that Lewis Warren had championed for decades was, genetically speaking, dead. Lucy Hanks really was a Hanks by birth, the daughter of and Lee Hanks, exactly as Herndon's account implied. And that meant Nancy Hanks Lincoln really was, as Lincoln himself had confessed in that buggy over a century and a half earlier, illegitimate. It was a stunning, clean resolution to one of the longest-running disputes in American biographical history. But it wasn't the only thing the DNA turned up. What caught the researchers off guard wasn't the illegitimacy confirmation. It was the specific haplogroup itself. X1c is not just uncommon. It's one of the rarer branches of mitochondrial haplogroup X anywhere in the human population, and it's especially unusual to find in a family with deep roots in colonial Virginia. A quick primer on why this matters. Geneticists trace all human maternal lineages back to a common ancestral population in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. As populations spread out and diversified over tens of thousands of years, distinct mutations accumulated in different branches of the human family tree, and those mutations are what define haplogroups today. Most people of British, Irish, or German descent, which describes the large majority of colonial-era Virginia settlers, carry haplogroups like H, J, T, U, or K. Haplogroup H alone accounts for close to half of all mitochondrial lineages in Europe. If you tested a random person with deep colonial Virginia ancestry, odds are overwhelming you'd land on one of those familiar European groups. Haplogroup X is different. It split into two major branches roughly 20,000 years ago, around the last glacial period. One branch, X2, spread across Europe and parts of the Caucasus, and notably also shows up at low frequency in some indigenous American populations, a fact that has fascinated researchers studying ancient migration into the Americas. The other branch, X1, took an entirely different route. It's concentrated overwhelmingly in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and parts of the Near East, and it never spread widely into Northern Europe the way X2 did. Some of the highest concentrations of haplogroup X in the world today are found among Druze communities in the Levant, where researchers see it as a kind of genetic time capsule reflecting ancient Near Eastern population history. X1c, the specific subgroup carried by Lincoln's maternal line, is a rare branch within that already uncommon X1 group. Its presence deep in the ancestry of a frontier Appalachian family caught the research team by surprise, and, as the researchers themselves noted, the extreme rarity of the marker actually strengthened confidence in the results, because finding the same unusual signature across multiple independent descendants is far more convincing than finding a common one. To be clear about what this does and doesn't tell us, this is ancient ancestry, not a recent secret about who Nancy Hanks's father was. It says nothing about the identity of that mysterious, well-bred Virginia man Lincoln mentioned to Herndon. What it does say is that somewhere far back in the deep history of the Hanks maternal line, long before anyone called themselves English, Scottish, or American, that lineage connects to population movements historians don't typically associate with a folklore of pure colonial Anglo stock. It's a small but genuine crack in a national mythology that likes to imagine early American families as ethnically uniform. The reality of human migration has never worked that way, for the Hanks family or for anyone else. It's worth pulling the camera back from the genetics and remembering that this is a story about an actual person, not just a data point in a haplogroup study. Nancy Hanks was likely born around 1784 in what was then Hampshire County, Virginia, territory that's now part of Mineral County, West Virginia. In 2008, the Mineral County Historical Society formally recognized the site there as her probable birthplace, and the following year the West Virginia legislature passed a resolution honoring her memory during the bicentennial of her son's birth. She grew up on the rough edge of the American frontier, in a world where record-keeping was an afterthought and families moved constantly chasing land and opportunity. When her grandfather Joseph Hanks died around 1793, 9-year-old Nancy went to live with her aunt, Elizabeth Hanks, and her aunt's husband, Thomas Sparrow. For much of her childhood, she was known as Nancy Sparrow rather than Nancy Hanks, which only added to the genealogical confusion later researchers had to untangle. Notably, the Sparrow household also took in another child born outside of marriage, Dennis Hanks, born in 1799 to Nancy's aunt. Illegitimacy wasn't a one-time scandal in this family. It ran through multiple branches of it. Despite the stigma attached to her birth, people who knew Nancy as an adult described her as